So today we're going to learn about a part of persuasion, and that is counter-argument. So obviously when you are trying to get your own point across, you want to be able to use the elements of persuasion to your advantage. So you're going to know how to use logos, ethos, and pathos in your own papers or anything else that you're going to be able to do. And you know how to analyze someone using those constructively for their own argument. But that's only half the battle sometimes, because a lot of times you'll be going up against people who have really well thought out positions themselves, who have a lot of good things to say, a lot of good points to make. And you're going to have to not only be able to address your own position, but you're going to have to be able to make theirs seem less appealing. So a lot of you guys are used to this in some level or another, pointing out the weaknesses in somebody's argument or position. This is what we call counter-argument. So when we look at the counter-arguments that show up in persuasion, we essentially are looking at them just sort of like as mirrors of the elements of persuasion right here, because essentially when we counter-argue, we're trying to make our opponent's elements of persuasion less effective. So we can do basically three things. We can attack our opponent's logos, which involves either making their evidence look flimsy or perhaps not sufficient, showing that their reasoning doesn't work very well, or showing that their conclusions aren't really well supported, or even just doubtful, just that we don't have enough evidence perhaps to make that kind of a conclusion. So that would help you make your opponent seem like their logos is not quite as sharp. You can also attack your opponent's pathos, and that one is going to involve mainly redirecting the emotions that an opponent is using towards different emotions. So for instance, right here, if someone's trying to make the reader feel fearful and you're trying to counter-argue them, you want to make them feel courageous instead. So instead of people trying to say, oh, you need to be worried about this, if you don't do what I say, then bad things will happen to you, then you would try to say something like, you can stand up in the face of such threats, you don't have to be, afraid, you're stronger and better and tougher than that. So you're making the audience feel the opposite emotion essentially right here. And that can go with a whole lot of different sorts of things. You can have people who are trying to appeal to, perhaps a sense of sadness. So if your opponent is appealing to the audience's sadness, then instead you can try to make the audience not feel sad, but instead feel disgusted, or instead feel something else that would make them do support your own particular platform a little more. Now, then the last one, attacking the opponent's ethos right here, has kind of two dimensions. So, number one, you can attack the opponent themselves, which is going to make them seem like you're trying to make them seem untrustworthy or lacking authority. Maybe you're just trying to point out that they don't seem to know the situation very well, or they're not very good at, projecting an air of authority or expertise. Or perhaps you're suggesting that your opponent actually has ulterior motives. So maybe they have some sort of selfish reason why they're holding this particular position. This one's a really common sort of attack on people when you're trying to, again, undermine their ethos, their authority as they speak. And likewise, you can attack their sources, the other areas, the other pieces of information who they are relying on for that kind of expert authority, by making them seem unreliable. Perhaps you attack someone's source by saying, oh, this comes from a biased perspective, or this comes from a group that has a stake in, the outcome, for instance. A lot of people would, for instance, attack a source about, let's say, the effects of oil, burning oil on the environment. And if you found out that that was put out by an oil company, you would be like, I'm going to attack that one's ethos, because obviously those people have a stake in the way that this argument plays out right here. Or likewise, you can just attack their sources as being too limited, similar to what we were doing with logos, by saying that these sources are just very small in perspective and they don't take into account enough stuff to be authoritative. Okay, so you're obviously going to need to do this in your major essays, because if you remember, one of the requirements that you have in that writing assignment, if I pull it back up right here, is to include a counter-argument. So you would have to be thinking, okay, what would someone else say about my position? What would they use to argue against me? And how am I going to put a counter-argument forward for that? Okay? So you would be thinking in your own paper, what's a common objection to my position someone might make, and how am I going to be able to turn that around using this sort of counter-argument method right here? How could I potentially attack their logos or their ethos or their pathos? Now, we're also going to get to see this, here in some of the Julius Caesar text. So the speech by Antony that you guys are reading in Scene 2 of Act 3 is one of the most famous ones in Shakespeare and is a really classic example of persuasion and especially of attacking your opponent, counter-arguing against them. So Antony here has been allowed to speak by Brutus at Caesar's funeral, but he's using the opportunity to undercut all of Brutus's arguments that he's just made for why they killed Caesar. His goal right here is to convince the plebs to turn on the conspirators and take revenge for Caesar's death. So he has a lot of different things that he says in here that are both, that support his own argument, but he has a few that are really interesting, again, examples of a counter-argument against Brutus. So for instance, we see repeated a lot right here, the Brutus is an honorable man line right here. So this one shows up right here, and then it shows up again, Brutus is an honorable man, and then it shows up, Brutus is an honorable man. It's repeated a ton through all of these sorts of lines right here. So what we might actually notice within all of this, if I can get over here to type out, oh well, I'll have to go over here. So we might notice that Brutus, or rather Antony, repeats the line that Brutus is an honorable man. So that, first of all, we could notice that that's a literary device. That's syntax or repetition. And we would also hopefully be able to tell that Antony doesn't really think that Brutus is an honorable man. This is sarcasm, which is itself another literary device. And so what he's doing right here is attacking Brutus's ethos, making him seem not honorable. And he's doing it in, again, a very subtle sort of a way. He's not straight up saying Brutus is dishonorable to attack his ethos. He's actually just repeating it so much with so many kind of like bad things around it that it makes it pretty clear right here that the plebs should notice themselves Brutus is not all that honorable. Now, there's also several good examples right here of Antony attacking the logos of Brutus's positions. So Brutus says he was ambitious, right? So that's one of the claims that Brutus has made. And then he goes through and he said, well, Caesar has brought many captives to Rome, whose ransoms did the general coffers fill. He's done a lot of things to help Rome. Did in this Caesar seem ambitious? When the poor have cried, Caesar has wept. Ambition should be made of sterner stuff. Yet Brutus says he was ambitious. So right here, what he's doing is essentially attacking Brutus's logos, the conclusion that Caesar was ambitious, by showing many examples that demonstrate that Caesar was not so ambitious. Now, of course, we've read the play. We know that Caesar's certainly very ambitious, but from Antony's perspective and from all the plebs' perspective right here, this makes all of Brutus's arguments seem like, again, they might be stretching it. They don't really have enough to conclude that Caesar actually was ambitious if there's all these other examples of him not being so. So he attacks the logos in those ones. And then last, let's get an example here of how he attacks the pathos. Brutus, if you remember, is just scolded the plebeians for approving of Caesar and holding him in such high regard when Caesar hated the democracy that makes Rome what it is. And then here we have Mark Antony speaking to them. You all did love him once, not without cause. What cause withholds you then to mourn for him? O judgment, thou art fled to brutish beasts, and men have lost their reason. So he says essentially right here, all of you plebs, you used to love Caesar, and yet now you all are withholding that love, withholding that mourning, just like beasts would. So in this one, he attacks Brutus's pathos, where the plebs, Brutus was appealing to the sense or feelings of dignity, basically saying that they should not pity Caesar, was a threat and should not be pitied. And Antony is turning that around to make the plebs feel guilty over abandoning Caesar after they loved him so much before. So these are just the first couple lines of Antony's speech, and it goes on for several more. So you're going to, in your assignments for today, spend a little bit of time going into other parts of this and finding the examples of Antony's attacks on Brutus's positions right here. And then likewise, you're going to have an assignment with your partners where you look at their body paragraphs and try to suggest counterarguments, trying to suggest ways that, again, they might have to address an opponent of their particular position. That's going to help them strengthen their own arguments and help them kind of include the counterargument component in their major essays. So, good luck with using this, and if you have any questions, make sure you reach out to me.